To disagree that if you could prove something which hasn't been proved, that you would then do something different, which is what you're saying.
That's right. All right.
So it's a pretty hypothetical question.
All right. And my second question is this, that if once the runs were restored as they were in 2010, the DFO managers continued to follow that same harvest strategy, they would be making a serious error. Correct?
I think that question requires a lot more analysis.
Yes.
And I think it's going to be interesting to observe what the effects are of that very high escapement returns to the 2014
Yes.
year returns.
Yes.
But there's a lot more work to be done to assess whether or not that's a big problem or not.
But surely there are laws in the science of population dynamics, just like there are laws that rocket scientists follow in physics.
Actually, they're not laws, they're theories. There's a difference. I mean, I'd say that there's a law of gravitation, but there isn't a law of stock recruitment. There are various theories of stock recruitment.
I've heard it described as the theory of gravitation.
Well, it seems to be working pretty well so far.
All right. So, let me ask you to turn to our document number 13. This is something that my junior came across quite by accident in the ringtail disclosures. It's entitled "Are Over-Escapement and Delayed Density Dependent Mortality Important Contributors to the Fraser Sockeye Situation?" DFO Science Branch, Fraser Sockeye Workshop, April 14th and 15th, 2011. As far as I know, we haven't heard anything about this. Selby, Hume, Grant, and others. You've had a look at this, I guess, in the advanced disclosure that you got?
Yes, I did look at it.
Yes. Did you know anything about this workshop prior to seeing that disclosure?
No.
Have you investigated since then what this workshop was about and the conclusions that they found?
No, all I've had a chance to look at is this document. I just got it last week.
All right. At page 008, see there's mention there, stationary model comparisons. These appear to be topics that were discussed. Stationary model residuals, Larkin versus Ricker. Larkin fit better than Ricker in 12 of 19 Fraser stocks. You don't know which of the participants concluded that, or whether they all concluded that?
Well, there's several summary statements here of what was in Peterman and Dorner, and I was thinking as I looked through this that what really should be done is to sit down with Randall Peterman and Bridget Dorner and just confirm that this is exactly what they would have concluded as well, because it's a fairly, this is the problem with PowerPoint. You have a bullet that summarizes a whole lot of information in several pages. So it seems generally consistent with what I had read, but sometimes the devil's in the details.
Jeremy Hume is the DFO expert on carrying capacity of the rearing lakes, is he not?
That's what I understand.
There's a conclusion at page 0011. A conclusion where DDD, which I think means delayed density dependence, exists. It persists across the entire 4-year cycle in agreement with Woody, LaPointe, and Hume. Causal mechanisms of DDD most likely stock specific. Do you agree with that conclusion?
Yes, and could you go to the next page as well? So I just draw your attention to the last bullet there.
Yes.
Density dependence and delayed density dependence likely contribute to reduced productivity in a number of stocks, but are unlikely the cause of the widespread declines observed within and beyond the Fraser River, which is consistent with the conclusions in our technical report.
Up at the top it says many Fraser stocks are sensitive to simple density dependence. You see that?
Yes.
And evidence of delayed density dependence, evidence exists of delayed density dependence in several stocks. Likely an important regulatory mechanism in specific stocks, i.e. quenelle, in relation to increased spawner abundance.
Yes, and that's IE, meaning one.
Well, it says it exists in several stocks, meaning more than one, correct?
Well, they actually found, Peterman and Dorner found there were, I think, 3. Stalaco was one, I can't remember the third. But quenelle was the only one for which they concluded that there was definitely delayed density dependence operating.
The analysis and the work has continued since then, and this is a 2-day workshop on that entire subject. So you'd expect some development beyond what Peterman and Dormer determined, would you not?
Well, since I wasn't there, I really don't know what they discussed and what evidence they used for that discussion, so it's hard for me to comment on that.
Do you see, turn to page 014. There are discussions here of record escapements, quenelle, 2001, 2002. And the S-max figure is given, range between 187 up to 334% beyond S-max. Shuswap 2010, high figure there is 481% beyond S-max according to the photosynthetic rate model. And Chilco, highest number there, 547% beyond S-max.
Yes, I see that. I also see on this graph, if you look at the top panel, what struck me about it for the quenelle stock is despite being way beyond the photosynthetic level and the S-max, the fall fry production when you get up to 1.5 million was still quite high, and in fact didn't follow the Ricker curve. It's actually above the Ricker curve. Now it could be that those fall fry are small, or the quality is poor, or the condition of smolts isn't good. There's a bunch of questions you don't know. So that would be, and maybe that work's been done, but that would be one of the things I'd be interested in, is to learn what actually happened from that brood year, and were there life history bottlenecks, and if so, where did they occur? And it's also going to be interesting to see in, I guess, 2011 or 2012, what the, I guess it would be 2012, what the fall fry are like in the Shuswap and the Chilco, both in numbers and quality.
Well, since you raised it with respect to quenelle, are you not aware that the escapements in 01 and 02 affected juvenile growth and fry adult survival?
I think there actually are some other diagrams in here earlier which looked at those, yeah.
Yes, and just for the record, I point out that Exhibit 562, which is Technical Report 3, at page 113, that statement appears. High escapements in 01, 02 affected juvenile growth and fry adult survival. And in Exhibit 399, page 10, this statement appears. Out-migrating smolts in 2004 were the smallest on record. That would be consistent with density dependence effects, would it not?
Right, that's interesting. And quenelle was the one stock that Peterman and Dorner felt there was evidence of both direct and delayed density dependence.
Now at page 115, or 0015, I mean, the next page, it refers to overescapements and productivity, refers to the Clark paper, that's the Alaska paper that we referred to. Declines in long-term productivity and increased spawner abundance variability when escapement goals were exceeded, believed to be linked to surpassing nursery ecosystem productivity capacity. Then the next heading is delayed density dependence, Clark et al. Delayed density dependence in 5 stocks where over-escapement occurred. Recruits per spawner fell below replacement for 2 to 5 years following consecutive over-escapements. And then the next page,
Sorry, could I just comment on this?
all right.
Since you raised it. So a couple of things. First of all, I don't think we have to go back to Clark at all, but the first two bullets here is a little bit of the tyranny of PowerPoint here, because they also mentioned that there were several cases where escapement goals were exceeded where it did not result in decreases in productivity. In that, we were just looking at that earlier when you went through that report,
Yes, right.
and I pointed that out. And also, I think it's also important that it was 5 out of 40 Alaskan stocks where overescapement occurred. Okay, so it wasn't that widespread.
Mr. Marmarak, would you accept that those attending this workshop have more experience and knowledge in the area of salmon population dynamics than you do?
I don't know everybody who was at that workshop, so I can't comment on that.
All right.
I think I have a fair amount of experience, and I think those people also have a fair amount of experience.
But population dynamics, I don't think, is one of your areas of specialty or expertise, is it? Fish population dynamics?
I haven't had as much experience as Randall Peterman or Carl Walters, but I have had a lot of experience with fish population
All right.
dynamics.
All right. On the next page, page 16, 2000, says 2010-11 in the Fraser, Shuswap, and Chilko, potentially severe density dependence in 2010. Depending on 2011 escapement, possible repeat of Quesnel Alaskan examples. So these, all you know is that these were topics discussed and possibilities expressed by this panel. Is that correct?
Yes, I think the Quesnel is an interesting case which should be further examined.
Do you agree with this, Mr. Marmarak, that I'm sorry, could I have this marked as the next exhibit, please?
Exhibit 1908.
And do you agree, Mr. Marmarak, that it is important that fishery managers adhere so far as possible to scientifically defensible escapement goals?
Yes?
Now, I've spent some time discussing the first 3 of your 4 criteria: plausible mechanism, exposure, spatial correlation. I'd like to turn briefly.
Sorry, it's not just spatial.
Oh,
It's either correlation over space and or time.
and time, I'm sorry. Now let's turn to your 4th criteria, whether there's corroborating evidence from cause-effect studies. Do you agree that there is empirical proof, firstly, of a limited carrying capacity in the rearing lakes for the Fraser River sockeye system?
Yes, I think there is a limit of carrying capacity in all sockeye lake rearing systems.
Yes. And specifically, are you aware that in this system, in some areas, zooplankton counts have been done, fry size analyses have been done, and photosynthetic rate calculations have been done to determine carrying capacity?
I'm familiar with using photosynthetic rate calculations to determine carrying capacity. I'm not as familiar with the specific application of zooplankton biomass estimates. I know there's correlations with carrying capacity, but I haven't seen those
All right.
applied to the Fraser.
Do you agree that there is empirical proof of spawner abundance well in excess of the PR photosynthetic rate calculated rearing capacity in all or most of the major Fraser runs?
No, I actually don't. And if you want to go to the Selby et al. Exhibit, this was in the Appendix C to Peterman et al. There is evidence for some of the Fraser River stocks that one time after 1990, the spawning escapements exceeded the photosynthetic rate. So you'd have to open Appendix C.
My question related to major stocks.
One of the problems I have with the figure in Selby et al. Is, and if we can find it, that's great, 573. So it doesn't, it shows the photosynthetic rate calculation, and then it shows the maximum. Yeah, we'll just go there because it's easier to describe it once you see it. Number 12, D12. So if you go down a bit, further. This one. So the green represents the maximum observed spawners after the 1990 brood year, and the blue hatched is the photosynthetic model optimum escapement. So you only have the maximum observed spawners. So if you look at the Shuswap, for example, you can see that yes, there was at least 1 year in which it was greater than the carrying capacity as estimated by the photosynthetic rate model. But you don't know how many years that was. And so, if you just go across there, you see Chilliwack, Lillooet, Shuswap, Chilco, Quesnel, and Trembleur had at least 1 year, but we don't know how many years, where it was greater than the photosynthetic escapement.
Yes. Well, we have had evidence of that, and I won't, of how many years, and I won't go into that with you. Let me simply ask you this. With respect to the Quesnel run, are you aware that it was the Quesnel run that was expected to be the largest run in 2009?
Yes, I am, and that's clear from a figure in our report, page 37.
Yes. And that according to Peterman and others, it failed through density-dependent effects.
Well, I'd have to review Peterman and Dorner's report to conclude that it specifically failed for that reason. I don't remember that he discussed that. I remember that he ascribed that single cause to the failure because there also were really lousy marine conditions in 2007 when all those stocks went out there. So I don't remember that he actually said that. If you can point me to the section where he actually says that in
I'm sorry, I'm not,
technical report 10, that'd be great.
I didn't mean to suggest it was the only cause.
Yeah, I don't believe that he actually specifically discussed the 2009 returns. If you can find that, that'd be great.
Well, I don't have the time to do that. I just want to do one housekeeping matter before I sit down. At our document 11, there's a basic text here, somewhat simplified text on the behavior and ecology of Pacific salmon and trout, Thomas Quinn. You saw this in the disclosures, I expect.
Yes, I did. This is well written.
Well written, thank you. At page, the passage that I've included here shows pictures of all the different food web organisms, among others. At page 176, there's a passage I want to ask you about. Page 176. Paragraph beginning for Anadromous sockeye, middle of the page. For Anadromous sockeye, the negative effect of fry density on growth may be offset to some extent by positive fertilizing effects of the carcass of the parents that spawned on them. Pausing there, there's studies that have been done on that I expect you're aware of, or you'd accept. Right. This sentence, in general, however, large escapements tend to give rise to numerous but slow-growing fry. You'd agree with that as a general term, correct?
Yes, I don't think we're disagreeing on the fact that density dependence can occur. I think we're disagreeing on the extent to which it was a primary factor causing the declines.
Could this be marked, please, as the next exhibit?
1909.
Those are my questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Marmorek.
Thank you.
Mr. Marmorek, my name is Don Rosenblum. I appear on behalf of Area D Gillnet, Area B Sainer. I see you're looking for some papers. Are you
Fine. Just
ready?
okay.
Thank you. I'll be very brief with you. I didn't have the privilege of hearing your testimony yesterday, but I gather you have said yesterday, and you in fact stated in your paper, which is before us, the technical report, Exhibit 1896, that you call for more research in the marine environment in terms of both Strait of Georgia, Johnson Strait, and up into the Gulf of Alaska, correct?
And Queen Charlotte Sound in particular.
Indeed. My question to you is, One of the intriguing stories of this inquiry is how the Harrison stock has had increasing productivity, and as a result, I want to focus very briefly in respect to Harrison. To what extent did you have data in respect to the Harrison migratory history?
The Harrison stock has a different migratory history, as you know, and in the statistical analyses which we did, which are described, summarized in section 4.7 of our report and described in detail in appendices 3 and 4, we basically lined up the life histories of all 18 stocks that we analyzed. And so the Harrison stock, which leaves early, doesn't spend as long rearing, has a different life history. And so when we lined up the environmental stressor variables, the Harrison stock is exposed to different years than, let's say, an Adams River stock, just because of their life history.
Were you limited in terms of data information in respect to Harrison in terms of carrying out discharging your responsibilities to this commission or your mandate?
Well, certainly there are limitations of data for all the stocks, including very detailed assessments of exposure to, for example, zooplankton abundance in the Strait of Georgia and other places. We used the variables that were available in our analyses, but as we've outlined, there are certainly gaps.
Am I right, sir, that there has not been telemetry work done on the Harrison?
Not to my knowledge, and I'm not sure how easy that would be to do given the size they are when they go out. Like if you're thinking about the post-style acoustic tags, I don't know if they're big enough to handle those.
I understand. Secondly, in terms of Dr. Christy Miller's work that is before this inquiry in terms of genomic signatures and so on, are you aware whether she did any analysis in respect to the Harrison stock in the context of her investigation?
No, I'm not.
And you would agree with me, would you not, that if indeed that work was done by her or is to be done in the future, that would be an important component in terms of the puzzle of trying to answer some of these really challenging questions, would you not?
I think it would be an important component. I think the paper by Dick Beamish that we mentioned earlier that specifically discusses the Harrison stock and the South Thompson Chinook stock talked about one of the key differences is their later arrival into the Strait of Georgia, and that they may be hitting the second zooplankton bloom and therefore have more food than fish which get out there May-June time period. So I think it's one factor, but it's not the only.
Okay. When you have given your plea, if I can describe it that way, for more research in respect to the marine environment, do you include the necessity of doing more work in terms of the Harrison?
Absolutely.
Which of course has a different migratory route out here.
Absolutely. I mean, it's very interesting because it's done better, and you wonder why. So I think it's a very valuable stock to focus on.
Yes, and had there been more information in that regard, it might have enhanced the substance of your analysis as provided in your report. You were lacking data.
Well, I would say that we used the data that we had, and certainly the Harrison stock had been examined at the PSC workshop and discussed by Dick Beamish in his presentation there, and I think Mark Trudell also talked about levels of food at different times during the year. So it's not as though we were completely without any information, and it was a particular interest at that PSC workshop.
Yes, I thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. Philip Isaac for Area E and the BC FSC. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's interesting to listen to the discussion on science and whether there's a delayed propensity effect or not. And I was interested in your comment. It'll be interesting to see what happens in 2014, given the high level of spawners in 2010. as a representative of commercial fishermen, we find that it's a little bit hard to listen to because really people's lives are being affected. And so what we hear from science a lot of times is more research, more research, more research. In the meantime, we have commercial fisheries closed, like in 2005, 2002. Doesn't science have a role in, if we're going to increase escapement, to do it in small steps rather than take a radical jump from year to year, given that people's lives are being played with?
There are two different parts to your question. One is, how do you implement a management action so that you learn as much as you can about the effectiveness of that action? I think we had a good discussion earlier with your colleague about adaptive management and designing experiments well. So I think that if you decide either to increase or decrease escapement, that you need to design that as a thorough management experiment, taking into account all the uncertainties. The second part of your question is, there are a bunch of different objectives that have to be balanced off in terms of wild salmon policy issues, First Nations concerns, fishermen, fish farmers. So science can help in articulating what the risks are and potential benefits to each of those objectives. But the trade-offs amongst those, that's a policy or political decision. That's not a science decision.
Mr. London, could I have an exhibit or my tab by Mr. Lackey, please? And I'm going to bring up this tab, and perhaps we can go to the second page and just the abstract. And could you tell me, if you read quickly, do you agree with Mr. Lackey's conclusion that science has to be performed appropriately without a policy bias?
Yes, I do.
And scientific enterprise has much to lose by doing otherwise?
Yes, and I think that's what I just stated.
Thank you. Could I enter this as an exhibit, please, Mr. Commissioner?
Exhibit 1910.
Now, at page 32 of your report, and I don't think we need to go there, you comment that over the past 2 decades, an increasing amount of en route mortality, but this results in reduced harvest as fisheries managers do their best to ensure spawners. That's not, and I think it's an unintentional thing in your paper, you're not saying that DFO managers did their best.
What I'm saying is that given that en route mortality was occurring, they had to make adjustments for that in the harvest to ensure that they were able to meet the escapement goals that they were trying to meet.
But you really have no idea whether they did their best or not, because there could have been a whole bunch of other factors.
I see you're focusing
the point I'm
on
getting
whether they actually did as well as they could have. Okay, so that's right. Maybe a better way to phrase that sentence is that en route mortality was taken into account in setting harvest rates.
Okay, I just
I
didn't
didn't want to take that little phrase out of context and say that, you know, DFO could never do better than they've done. That's not what the intention was of that sentence.
Yeah, just best is a bit of an advocacy word, so that's why I wanted to get that off the record. Thank you. Your firm does a fair amount of work for government, either directly or by organizations funded by government. Is that correct?
We've done a lot of work for government institutions. We've done a lot of work for international institutions, for non-government organizations, crown corporations like BC Hydro, Bonneville Power Administration that runs dams in the Columbia River. So many of our projects involve actually a mix of clients where we are doing technical analyses and technical facilitation that are attacked by all sides, maybe not unlike here.
Your firm, in fact, has been retained, continues to be retained by a couple of organizations that are still in this, that are parties in this inquiry. Is that correct?
I don't know which ones you're referring to.
Tsawwassen and Haida?
Oh, I think we've done one study for the Tsawwassen First Nation. The Haida? I'm not familiar with work that we've done for... I think the Tsawwassen First Nation, we were critiquing an environmental impact assessment of Delta Coal Port expansion. That's my recollection. I wasn't involved on that project specifically. I don't remember a project we did with the Haida. So,
if you were working for a party in this commission, say my organization, and you testified before the commission, there'd be concerns about the weight to give to your evidence given your relationship with a party before the commission, wouldn't there?
I don't think so, sir. I mean, everything we do, we try to do to the highest possible standards of neutrality, and throughout the 30-year history of our company, we've avoided taking positions to benefit the position of a client just because they're paying the bill. If that's what your intent of your question is, I thoroughly reject it.
So no problem with an appearance of conflict or bias because...
No.
Thank you. Now, you said that the run in that the water in the Mid-Pacific was quite cold in 2008, which may have led to the big run in 2010. Fraser.
That's what Dr. McKinnell had in his report. He said it was the coldest temperatures in 35 years.
Yeah. Now, you're aware that from 1997 to 98, there was a 21-year warm water phase with variances that were double in the years preceding 2008 in terms of warm water.
I'm sorry, you said in 1997 and
1977 to 1998. That was a 21-year.
Oh, you're talking about
warm
the
water
Pacific
phase.
Decadal Oscillation
Yes.
regime shift? Yeah.
And one of our biggest runs ever was, of course, in 1993. And Fraser Sockeye was rebuilt substantially during the 70s and 80s. Is that correct?
Right. Well, the thing is, these Pacific Decadal Oscillations are not like an on-off switch in your house. They have oscillations within the oscillation. So it's roughly a 30-year oscillation, like from the mid-40s to the mid-70s was generally cooler and wetter, and then from the mid-70s through to roughly 2000 was generally warmer and drier. But within those time periods, there's La Nina events, like the Hyatt paper talks about. There's various events where things get better. So it's not just all bad and then all good.
So you don't know that during the 1977 to 94 period, there was 21-year warm period. That's your testimony?
Within that time period, there were fluctuations, and if you want to go back to the...
I'll move on, thank you. You said in response to Mr. Harvey's...
I would like the witness to be able to complete his answer.
Well, I just wanted to say that the MACUS index that we were looking at earlier, which is affected by both temperature and other indices, showed fluctuations, both good and bad, during some of that same time period.
Okay, so you don't agree with me then, if I get this right, between 1977 and 1994, there was a warm water period in the Mid-Pacific that had double the variance in warm water compared to your kind of period immediately prior to 2008.
So I don't know what you mean by double the variance. I don't know exactly what variance you're assuming. What I'm indicating is that I agree that generally the period from the mid-70s onward was generally warmer and drier, but that within that period there were certainly better and worse years, and there's lots of evidence to show that. It's not like it's all bad every year. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Now, you said in response to Mr. Harvey's question about when he asked you about, why was Columbia and Bristol Bay good, you said because, they're not the same stock groups, and we really shouldn't go beyond 500 miles in comparison. Kilometers in comparing stock groups. But I noted at page 34 of your report, and we've gone to it a couple times this morning, you refer to Barkley Sound, Central Coast, Skeena River. Those are more than 500 kilometers, certainly the Skeena's.
So I think you have to remember, when Mr. Harvey was asking that question, he was asking it to me in the context of an adaptive management experiment where you might want to change harvest policy for one set of stocks and compare it to another set of stocks. And what I was saying there is that if you were going to do an adaptive management experiment like that, you would want to choose stocks which were fairly close so that they would have reasonably similar ocean entry timing and reasonably similar migration routes, so you could isolate the effects of the harvest. So now what you're talking about are the broad-scale patterns that Drs. Peterman and Dorner looked at, which are the patterns that we're trying to explain, and that's a different question.
Well, let's look at Barkley Sound. In the 1990s and early 2000s, we had a tremendous problem with mackerel and ate a huge amount of smolts. Is that correct?
I wasn't familiar with that, but
Not
I'll take your word for it.
And then you cite the Central Coast and a Wicono Lake. Wasn't that one of our first areas where we ran a large escapement program as an experiment?
Yes, and if you could just actually go to...
Thank you. I don't have time to go to it, so I'm just trying to get my questions out.
You actually, in my submission, do have
I just
to let the witness
suggest you put
answer
up page
the question.
34 of my report while you're talking about Awikeno Lake, because I think it's important. It doesn't, I won't use any more time other than to have it up there while you're talking about it. Thanks. It's the upper right figure with the blue triangles.
Yeah. And were you aware that fishermen were protesting the spraying of the forest up there with a herbicide to encourage forest growth at the time?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Now, you also cite the Skeena River. Wasn't the Skeena River another river where we had massive overescapement and it resulted in IHN viruses on the spawning grounds?
I've heard about that. I don't know much about it in detail. I just wanted to point out that Awikeno Lake is one of several stocks in the Central Coast and in Southeast Alaska who have shown similar timing and the Yakutat of declines. It wasn't unique. And so the fact that there was increased escapement on there is not sufficient explanation for why, on Awikeno Lake, sufficient explanation for why the other stocks would decline.
If there was a reduction of fishing effort on Awikeno, those other stocks fished basically run together up to that area, don't they?
Some of them, you're saying that all of these stocks, including Southeast Alaska and
I
the
think
Yakutat, would have all increased in
No.
escapement because of reduction in harvest on Awikeno Lake? I don't think so.
Given
sir.
my limit in time, I'll move on. Thank you. Now, if ocean conditions, and I want to separate, and I think it's helpful for the Commission to separate our mid-Pacific Ocean conditions from the estuary and Johnson Straits area and Queen Charlotte Sound. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
That might, I mean, we had really good pink salmon runs on the Fraser.
I'm sorry, when?
We've had very good pink salmon
recently?
runs.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. That's a contrast to what's happened on Fraser sockeye.
Yes.
Decent chum runs in the Fraser, past decade or so.
So I understand. I don't know the details of that.
High Alaskan and Russian sockeye runs. Past decade or so.
In general, over the last few decades, they've been going up.
Large chum runs in Hokkaido.
I didn't know about that, but take your word for it.
And then Mr. Harvey and you talked earlier about Harrison sock. And of course this year we have a very large successful sockeye run into Harrison Lake. Somas River, is that correct?
Sorry, I don't know the details of this year's run in the Somas River.
Now, in terms of the Pacific Ocean, one of the big factors is when the wind blows from the north, it's cold, and that affects the temperature of the Pacific. Is that correct?
The wind patterns and temperature patterns are pretty complicated as described in Skip McKinnell's report, so I wouldn't want to just make one generalization about wind patterns. Oceanographers have lots of discussion about these things.
In any event, the minister can't change which way the wind blows as much as he'd like to.
Yes, I wouldn't disagree with you on that.
So, in terms of fishery management, let's say that you're correct that ocean conditions in the mid-Pacific affect what's come back in the last few years. You couldn't...
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify, it's not so much mid-Pacific, it's the coastal migration that
So
we're
you're
talking
saying
about.
coastal migration.
That's the life history stage that we've been talking about, not the mid-Pacific as the primary cause of the decline. So it's Georgia Strait and Queen Charlotte Sound that we're talking about, not the mid-Pacific.
That's quite helpful. Now, at page 48, you report amongst all the factors that science has looked at in this commission, you conclude that climate change is really the only possible factor.
No, that's not correct. On page 48, oh, I'm sorry, you're at 48. Okay, I thought you were talking about the overall. This is for one life history stage only. So this is just for the Fraser sockeye salmon as they're going. This is eggs, alevins, fry, and par. So this is just the egg to par life history stage.
So at that point, the only factor is climate change.
Right, and you'll notice it's rated as a possible factor. The correlation and consistency was fairly weak evidence there, so it's not a very strong case, not as compared to the main factors that we talk about in the coastal migration stage, which would be life stage 3,
Right.
where we say that marine conditions and climate change are the likely primary drivers of the
Yeah.
long-term pattern.
Now, I note on the ESSA website that you advertise climate change adaptation and carbon accounting as two significant parts of ESSA's business.
Adaptation, yes.
Now, I don't see any mention of that in this technical report.
No, because it isn't relevant.
Well, isn't it one of the ways, I mean, as a layman, and I'm not a lawyer, and perhaps there's rules here I don't understand, but as a layman, isn't one of the ways to deal with where somebody would say you have a conflict would be to declare it and get it right up front? Or a bias?
Pardon me, what's the conflict? I don't understand what the conflict is.
If you're making, well, let's put it this way. If the commission finds that climate change is to blame for the problems in Fraser Sockeye, your firm would undoubtedly be bidding on jobs and earning revenues from helping fishery managers and accommodate and adapt to climate change.
So this is sort of akin to saying that if I were a carpenter and I put my foot through somebody's stairs because there was some rotten wood and I pointed that out to him, that I was really just trying to generate business? Is that your argument?
No, I'm just pointing out that in terms of science and the key role that science has in forming political decision makers and the really important necessity to separate advice and revenues or possible benefits. Do you understand that at all? Not a concern?
The reports we write, sir, are reviewed by many different entities, and because of the kinds of work that we do, those entities often are adversaries around particular issues. And so we work to the highest possible scientific standards. Most of you'll see in my CV that I published many peer-reviewed articles. So the fact that we mention climate change as a possible factor, and the fact that we also do work on climate change adaptation, is completely irrelevant. Those two things are completely disconnected.
So in your view, but to a fisherman on the dock, it might not be.
Well, I can't claim to explain the
That's fair
reasoning
enough.
by which you're linking these two things.
Thank you. Now I want to go back, because if we look at 1992, we saw the decline in productivity. We saw some management changes, and I kind of want to focus on the things that have changed.
Sorry, I just wanted to point out the decline in productivity happened a lot earlier than 1999. It actually started.
1992.
Yeah, well, and some of the stocks, as I won't show the diagram, but as we talk about in section 4.1, some of the declines started even earlier than that for some of the stocks.
Okay, so let's talk about changes that happened since 1992 that we can put a finger on and that the managers have some control over. So in 92 we had the introduction of a very large new commercial fishery in river. That's one aspect of change, correct?
I don't know the full history of all the changes in fisheries over this whole period of time. We're looking at the pattern in recruits per spawner and trying to explain that. And the recruits include escapement, harvest, and en route mortality. So the fact is that even after you've added in harvest and en route mortality, there's been a decline in productivity, and that's what we're trying to explain. So
Right.
actually, the amount of harvest doesn't really affect the estimate of recruitment. It just gets, I mean, it does affect the total recruitment, but it doesn't help to explain the pattern of decline in recruits per spawner, because it's already considered in recruitment.
I understand that, but I'm trying to focus on issues that have changed since 1992, because it seems to me when I read through all the science reports, we don't have a lot of conclusive answers. Is that fair to say?
I think there's disagreement on various issues, and I actually think there's a fair agreement on a lot of issues. For example, if you look at the overall conclusions of our report in terms of which factors are unlikely to have been responsible, I haven't heard from many other people much disagreement about those. So
Okay.
we're able to make some useful conclusions,
Yeah.
despite the lack of evidence.
I'm almost done my time, and let's just go quickly through the other factors. Fish farms are a pretty big development since 92.
Yeah, and earlier.
Very large escapements on Fraser Sockeye since 92.
Yes.
Large pink abundance since 92. Possible predator effects.
With oscillations.
Warm water in the Fraser in some years. Fairly.
Increasingly so. You're talking about the returns now, the en route mortality, or
No, I'm just talking about things that have changed, and if I was trying
2-degree change, I think, over the last 40 years, I believe, or maybe 50 years.
And of course, we have 15 million sockeye lost between the spawning grounds and the mouth of the river during this period. So if you
Sorry,
were,
do you mean it the other way around?
well, from the spawning grounds, or sorry, from the river to the spawning grounds.
Sorry, are you adding the number up over many years, or what?
Well, I'm adding the number up since that's in evidence.
Yeah, I'm sorry,
Okay.
I haven't seen that
So,
evidence, so I don't know what
now
that is.
my final question is, if you're a fisheries manager, you can't control which way the wind blows, but you can control to some extent poaching in the Fraser, over escapement, the amount of fish you put on the spawning grounds. Isn't that what you should focus on as a fishery manager?
I think as a fishery manager, you have a really tough job because you have to balance many different objectives, including the wild salmon policy. You're trying to also meet harvest objectives. You've got en route mortality happening. You've got a difficulty of meeting harvest targets. So I think as a harvest manager, the best thing you can do is, if you're contemplating alternative harvest approaches, is that you systematically do a decision analysis of the possible outcomes of those different actions for all those different objectives, given all those different uncertainties, including the marine conditions. I think that's the approach that modern day risk assessment fish biologists and population dynamics experts would recommend.
So you've done a cumulative effect analysis of science issues. Can you tell me why there hasn't been a cumulative effect analysis of the management decisions? Wouldn't that give us more light on what's happened in Fraser sockeye?
Well, I think the report by Carl English, I can't remember the number, for the Cohen Commission looks at some of those management questions and the ability to meet escapement targets, the ability to meet harvest targets, if that's what you're referring to. I think there has been a fair amount of work done. I wasn't at the hearings where Carl testified, so I don't know.
My time is done, Mr. Commissioner. There's one other issue that I quickly wanted to raise. Commission counsel and ourselves have been disputing whether a document from testimony before the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans concerning set net dropout rates should be admitted to the Commission. And we haven't agreed on it, but I didn't want to take up a bunch of time today, and I wondered if you had a process in mind, because I think the document is quite important.
It's inadmissible for parliamentary privilege reasons, and Parliament hasn't waived privilege over that document, so it's not admissible, which is the point I've made to Mr. Eidsvik. So I'm certainly not going to agree or recommend that there's a process in place to admit that document.
And there's a serious dispute on whether the privilege belongs to the person who testified or Parliament, and the law is not clear on that at all.
Callan, CA.
Yes, I'm sorry, Mr. Eidsvik, I'm sorry, I obviously can't respond to you because I'm unaware of this contest between you and Commission Counsel.
Yes.
But obviously, if you have positions to express, I assume you've either expressed them to Commission Counsel or you will express them, so at some point, this issue that you've raised can be resolved one way or the other.
I have a feeling we've been going back and forth for several months on it, and I think in the end you're going to have to decide, Mr. Commissioner.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that, Mr. Hogan.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Commissioner, in any event, the document hasn't been put to any witness, so there's a sort of an initial hurdle that needs to be dealt with in that there's been no witness here to speak about this document in the first place. In second place, there is a privilege that attaches to that document that's not been waived. So there's a couple of hurdles. I don't know what point there is in carrying on this dispute. There's no mechanism right now to get this document before the Commissioner.
Mr. Commissioner, I didn't put the document before the Commission this morning. I can see my friends are up and ready to go, and I know Canada will disagree. But it deals with the question of how many fish are dropping out of set nets, and if the evidence was right by that biologist, it's a major factor in what's going on in the disappearance of Fraser River sockeye.
Well, I think, Mr. Eidsvik, with respect to the issue that Commission Counsel has raised initially is a key issue, that is to say the privilege issue. And so obviously that's not going to be resolved at this moment in time.
Yes, I
so
agree.
thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry to keep delaying on this, but in the interest of time and efficiency, even if we said that there was no privilege attached to this document, there's nobody here to talk about what is in that document, to identify it or to speak to it. The weight that would be attached to that document is non-existent, so I don't know why we're going to continue to take up time on this particular issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Baker. Sorry.
Just for the record, Carl English's technical report was technical report number 7, exhibit 718, which the witness just referred to.
Thank you, Ms. Carter. Ms. Callan?
I just wanted to put on the record that the province of British Columbia supports the Commission Council's position.
Just for the record, so does the Government of Canada support the Commission's position.
The Federation of Drift Fishers. You've been examined fairly closely on some fairly detailed issues this morning. Mr. Mamerick, you can relax. I'm going to give you an opportunity to exercise your pedagogical skills and talk about your report, and particularly the notion of evidence. Like Mr. Leadham, I compliment you on the clarity of the report. Even I could understand it, I think. You used some terminology with respect to evidence that I'd like you to open up a little bit on for the assistance of not only me, but especially the Commission, and use the terms the breadth of evidence, the depth of evidence, and the weight of evidence. And I'd like you to, if you would, expand a little bit upon those concepts, and in particular on how they apply to the way you put together your report, and in particular the limitations that result, the kinds of limitations that result in your report on those areas.
Okay, thank you for that interesting question. So maybe I could just go to page 24 of our report, because it'll help me to answer your question as I go through it. So if you can expand that figure, Mr. Lunn. So this is the decision tree that we used to decide on the relative likelihood that different factors were responsible for observed declines in sockeye productivity. And so these are the different categories of evidence. Is there evidence of plausible mechanism? Is there evidence of exposure to a stressor? Is there evidence of correlation, consistency between the stressor and productivity? And then is there other evidence, such as laboratory experiments, thresholds, and the like? So when it comes to the breadth of evidence, I think there we're talking about the breadth of evidence across different stressors that are affecting different life history stages. So for the freshwater habitat, we have logging, mining, small-scale hydro, large-scale hydro, urbanization, agriculture. So that's kind of a breadth issue. And then depth of evidence relates to, well, how good is the evidence for each of those stressors? And so, as we talked about several times, for exposure, let's say we had very poor data for disease, so no conclusion was possible. And then, on the other hand, for some water quality contaminants, we had quite good data, not all of the water quality data. So there we have deeper evidence over space and time, and in fact, we're able to examine the correlation of changes in contaminants with change in productivity, and it turned out for the things that have been measured anyway, there wasn't a good correlation. There was evidence against the idea that water quality contaminants were causing sockeye declines. And then the weight of evidence, the last part, is really looking at the relative degree of evidence across all these different stressors, using this decision tree to try to pull out at the bottom of the tree, really, which things fall out as being unlikely for one or more reasons. There's 5 different ways to get to the unlikely side, unlikely conclusion, or possible, or likely, or very likely. And so that we're basically weighing all of the evidence together for the different stressors to try to come to our conclusions.
And do I read your report right when I get the impression that you see the strength of your analysis in the breadth of the evidence relative to the other two?
Well, I think the strength of the analysis is that we went through a very systematic approach to all of the evidence that was there. So I would call that the third, the weight of evidence. For the evidence that we had, we looked at it in a very systematic way. And where we didn't have evidence, we indicated what those limitations were, like I just mentioned for disease. In some cases, the depth of evidence is really great. Like, for example, en route mortality. I mean, the story's sad. The en route mortality is going up. But the evidence as to why it's happening and that it is happening is very strong.
Well, the thrust of my question was, I mean, what you're looking for is an explanation of an overall trend as distinct from stock-specific issues.
Yes, that's correct.
Right. And the strength of the analysis of an overall trend is, of course, the breadth of the evidence, the number of factors that it considers. Is that
That's correct.
fair way of
And the
putting it?
breadth, I think the breadth is both the number of factors that are considered and also the very helpful contrast that you get by looking across both Fraser stocks and non-Fraser stocks.
Right. And of course, the depth and the weighing of the evidence depends upon the strength of the individual reports that comprised the subject matter of your synthesis.
That's correct.
You would agree with me, would you, that in a perfect world, you would want to be, as a scientist, a perfect scientific world, you would want to be concerned with both the overall trend and stocks.
Absolutely.
And particularly with respect to important stocks which are significant for one reason or another, especially significant.
I think it's important to look at the major stocks which comprise the fishery, as well as the other stocks.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
If I could just, if Ms. Baker will permit me, and if somebody will give me a minute of their time. I just wanted to, I think this is, it's not directly dealing with, excuse me for this microphone awkwardness, but not dealing directly with Mr. Lowe's question, but I just wonder if Mr. Mamera could just go to, just to explain to me and just clarify on page, in the executive summary, it may be the best place, Mr. Mamera, to let me ask you my question. And I'm going to be brief. I just need clarification. I don't think there's a page number, but it's just where you deal with, I'm going to call it page 2. It starts off based on the available evidence.
Yeah.
We then came to a conclusion whether the factor was unlikely, etc. Just adding on to Mr. Lowe's question and your answers, you give there the possible, likely, or very likely, representing the highest level of confidence, and then to have been the primary driving factor. And then you deal with, I believe, unlikely, and so on. I just want to make sure I understand where that terminology comes from, and just the weighting that you've ascribed. The word probable doesn't appear there, and lawyers and judges are often more comfortable with concepts like balance of probabilities that you've heard frequently, I'm sure, and that kind of thing. I just want to make sure my head's in the right space from your perspective when you set this terminology.
That first sentence there is, we came to a conclusion whether the factor was unlikely, representing the lowest level of confidence. So that's basically, if you think of the lowest level of probability that the factor was a primary driver of the overall declines, whereas at the other extreme, very likely representing the highest level of confidence or highest level of probability, but it's all relative probabilities. It's not like we can say 0.93,
Right.
0.02. So we're making a ultimately qualitative judgment based on all of the evidence for each of those factors on the relative likelihood that they were a primary factor driving the overall declines in productivity.
And the word possible in the context of likely or very likely, how does that fit together?
So it fits within the decision tree that we were just putting up there, in the sense that if, for example, if we could just go to page 24, I think it'll be easier for me to answer that question, because there's a variety of ways by which we come to that conclusion. So if, for example, as you come down this decision tree, and let's say you have some data on the exposure of sockeye to a given stressor. So, for example, predators, we have some data that say stellar sea lions have changed this much, harbor seals have gone up. We have some data that way. So the answer to that exposure question is yes. It's possible that some predators have gone up. And then you come down and to the correlation consistency box. Well, for predators, there were no analyses done as to, until we did our own, as to whether or not predators went up at the same time as sockeye productivity went down. So you drop down to where the left side of that diagram has other evidence, and then it says no data, and then you conclude possible. So essentially it's following our decision tree, where if on the other hand we had found evidence that was saying yes, there is a correlation that, you know, predators went up and sockeye went down, and it looks like these particular predators could well have been responsible. And there was other evidence as well, like we found sockeye in those predator stomachs. We might well have ended up at the bottom right there with likely or very likely, but we didn't have that evidence.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Commissioner, it's Brenda Gertner, and with me Crystal Reeves for the First Nations Coalition. And I am not going to try to be a rocket scientist today, or any day, and I'm going to use a different metaphor that I'm sorry, Mr. Commissioner, you've heard a couple times, but at this point in this inquiry I find it a little inspiring. I have been using the migratory route of the salmon and where we are in this inquiry, and I feel like the cumulative impacts of this inquiry have resulted in many multiple stressors that I'm working very hard to avoid en route mortality, and I can smell my natal stream, and I'm keeping my focus and looking forward to getting home. And so
shall we reduce the temperature here?
That would be helpful some days, that's for sure. But that's the metaphor I'm sticking with, and that's where we are. And Mr. Marmurek, before I start my questions of you today, I just want to observe on the evidence. We've never worked together before. I met you for the first time yesterday, and I'm just very grateful for the amount of work that you've done to prepare to come here. I'm grateful that you've read all the documents in the short period of time that you have, and that you have a substantive answer for many of the hard questions. And I just, I want to express the gratitude of my client and me for the work that you've done.
Thank you.
Now, just to let you know, I've got about 45 minutes of my own time, and I understand from some of my friends that if I'm doing well and being useful, they'll give me a bit more of their time, so I may have a little bit more time after lunch. But we're going to start with that. And I've got a couple of themes that I'm going to let you know that I'm going to cover so you get a sense of where I'm going to go. I want to talk about specific questions, both the specific questions that you've asked and the questions that you were asked and questions that weren't asked. I need to touch a little bit on biodiversity within the Fraser River sockeye salmon and the importance of scale going forward. I want to talk a little bit about cumulative impacts and climate change. And then primarily at the end of it, I want to go into your recommendations at the end of your paper and unlock some of them, because on the face of it, I'm a little bit worried that we might get confused in applying them, and I want to give you an opportunity to help us as we go forward. I'm going to ask an obvious one first, just to lead up to my more difficult question, I think. You'll agree with me that the question, what happened in 2009, is a bit of a different question than what's the explanation for the long-term declining trends. Agree with me on that?
Yes, I would.
Now, apparently in your terms of reference, the only question you were asked for the paper was whether cumulative impact assessments could help understand the pattern of change in productivity in Fraser River sockeye salmon over the past several decades, correct?
Well, actually, if we were to look at that precisely, we'd have to look at the terms of reference for our study, which are in one of the appendices, but it's a little broader than that.
But when I looked at your framework, you're primarily approaching the question of how cumulative impacts can assess understanding the long-term patterns of change, correct?
We were looking at long-term patterns of change in both productivity, but also, as you'll note in some of the footnotes to that final conclusions table in section 4.7, we also considered effects on escapement and effects on harvest as well.
So
because the terms of
abundance.
reference of the Cohen Commission are also the fishery not
Right.
just productivity.
Okay, so point well taken, thank you. But I want to ask another important question of this inquiry, and one that, Mr. Commissioner, our clients made submissions right at the beginning, which was when we asked to look at the broad questions you were going to be asked. We said right at the beginning that in our view, cumulative impacts was an important component of explaining 2009. And I want to turn now to you to ask you, based on the work that you've done, all the reports that you've read, all the work that you've done in your career, is it reasonable to conclude that the cumulative exposure of Fraser River sockeye salmon to multiple stressors caused or significantly contributed to the unexpected low returns in 2009?
So that question was addressed in both the PSC workshop report, and actually they spent more time talking about 2009 specifically than we did in our report. But our conclusion was, and it's in section 4.4, that the marine conditions were the most likely primary factor causing the declines, the poor returns in 2009, both the condition, in 2007, the conditions in the Strait of Georgia and Queen Charlotte Sound, and it's near the end of that section, and that these other factors certainly could have contributed to that,
And so
but those are the primary factors.
So for the 2009 return, cumulative or multiple stressors, most likely in the marine environment, were the primary causes.
That's what we concluded.
Yes, thank you. I want to make that clear on the evidence. And now, is it also reasonable to conclude that the cumulative exposure of Fraser River sockeye salmon to multiple stressors is contributing to the long-term decline in productivity we are observing since at least the 1990s, if not earlier, in some stocks?
This is where it gets tricky, because we don't have a cumulative stress meter that we can stick into sockeye and determine how that overall stress is going up, or what the contributors are to that overall stress. So it's reasonable to assume that there are interacting factors that affected those trends. And what we tried to do in this report is to look at the best evidence we can of the relative likelihood. And so, I think if you look at, I think it's probably fair to look at the table in section 4.7, because it's kind of a integrative result of all our conclusions. At page 90 in the document, and it's updated with aquaculture in the addendum, but this is fine for now. This is our summation, really, of what we think the relative likelihoods are of these different factors. And those that are listed as being unlikely, it doesn't mean that they couldn't have contributed, but we don't think that they were the primary drivers.
Right. So there is quite a bit of difference because they could, in any one given year, have a particular effect on a particular stock, but that all of them together could easily have a contributing effect to the long-term decline. And that as scientists, you're looking for a primary driver at a mathematical level or otherwise, but from an Aboriginal way of being or a holistic perspective, the cumulative impacts are a valuable, unique look at what might be driving the vulnerability of sockeye salmon.
I think it's important to consider the cumulative impacts, and I think it's also important to try to hone in as much as you can on the major factors as opposed to the minor factors, and that's what we tried to do through all of these analyses.
In order to help make us, as managers, better decision makers, right? I mean, that's the purpose.
Right, and so, for example, I don't think that adding more logs into streams that sockeye might spawn in is going to make much difference to the overall life cycle productivity.
Gotcha. I understand that. Okay, now would you agree that given the complexity, and I very much enjoyed studying the diagram that you have of the life cycles and all the interactions that are possible in any one year or a cycle for a salmon. Would you agree that this complexity and the unique combinations that are possible and the unique multiple stressors in any given 1 year gives us cause to be very humble about what we think we know and how we act when harvesting sockeye?
Yes, I think humility is wise, and data can help to diminish humility.
But you also agree, and I've read this in many critiques of scientific thought, that we have to be careful about what we think we know, what we know we don't know, and what we don't know we don't know.
Yes, I believe that was a former Department of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, so I don't like quoting that for various other reasons.
I didn't quote him either. I didn't quote him either. But it's an important component of the complexities
No,
we're
absolutely.
dealing with.
I mean, that was one of the things he got right.
All right. Thank you very much for those beginning questions. Now I want to go to biodiversity within the Fraser River sockeye salmon. And I could take you to Exhibit 1855 if you want. This is a study, just a more recent study, that on the effects of river temperature on migratory Fraser River sockeye. You're aware of this study?
Yes.
And you agree that this study highlights how climate change is impacting on sockeye in the Fraser River currently and how it's expected to do so going forward. And it has some analysis on a stock-specific level, correct?
Yes, it's a good paper.
All right. Given that, would you agree that the type of research and data we are going to need going forward to study the interactions of multiple stressors, including the variety of possible climate change stressors and on stock health, is at a conservation unit specific level?
So there's 36 conservation units in the Fraser, and I think there are tough decisions to be made as to how you choose which of those you want to study really intensively. It's a breadth versus depth question, and what we recommended is that you choose a representative cross-section for more detailed studies rather than try to cover all 36.
Yeah, and I'm going to get to that because I'm going to take you right to your recommendations.
Sure.
But you'll agree that we need to take care on that because there might be quite a different question as to what effect does climate change have on early or late summer Fraser River sockeye than a question that says, how can my priority to fish for food, social, and ceremonial purposes be met on the early Stewart runs? Those are very different questions.
Absolutely, and you have to look at multiple objectives.
Do you agree that research and management decisions and conclusions regarding climate change and multiple stressors on Fraser River sockeye salmon could be more helpful if nested within an adaptive management strategy going forward?
Yes.
Now, yesterday you spoke about a number of comparisons to the non-Fraser River stocks, and there was some discussion on the Harrison. We picked this up a little bit, but I want to make sure the evidence is clear. When you were talking about the Chinooks, you were talking about the the Shoe Shop South Thompson stocks of Chinook. Is that correct?
Yes, I think it's in one of the papers by Beamish that's included in 62 documents. There's actually a map there. I don't remember the number. I can dig it out, but so if that's an important detail, we can find it. But
What's important, as I understand it, is that both that stock and the Harrison stock are flourishing somewhat over the last 2 or 3 cycles, and they have similar migration patterns from the freshwater. Is that correct?
yes, I think the key point of that paper was that they arrive late in the Strait of Georgia.
All right, so now let's move to climate change. And do you agree that baseline data regarding sea surface temperature is critical to maintain? And are there other, and if so, are there other data sources, baseline data sources regarding climate change that you would recommend for the purposes of management of Fraser River sockeye salmon?
So yes, I would agree that sea surface temperatures are very important. Salinity is also important. And within the freshwater cycle, I think it's very important to understand temperatures within rearing lakes and streams and how they may be changing. That data aren't too expensive to acquire. And also the timing of smolt emigration towards the estuary, actually, and arrival in the Strait of Georgia relative to the timing of zooplankton blooms, which are important for food.
Would you agree that setting management targets for Fraser River sockeye salmon on the principle of maximum sustainable yield historically assumed or depended on a constant and predictable ecosystem?
Yes, there is a paper by Peter Larkin called An Epitaph for the Concept of Maximum Sustainable Yield. So I think there has been increasing recognition that stock recruitment relations vary from over different periods, and that fisheries management needs to adapt accordingly.
Would you also agree that the MSY calculations are only potentially relevant for predictably strong stocks in a predictable ecosystem?
Well, I think theoretically, maximum sustainable yield could apply to any stock, provided that you have reasonable data on that stock recruitment relationship, not only strong stocks. I mean, there is the challenge of mixed stock fisheries and how you can allow harvest on a very strong stock while at the same time maintaining the weaker stocks, and that's an implementation challenge for sure.
Now, you spoke briefly this morning about the precautionary approach and the precautionary principle. And before I get to your recommendations, which I promise I'll take you to, I want to take you to RTAB 7. You familiar with this article?
Oh yes, that was one that you passed around, yeah.
And you'll agree that this is a study that's been done out at UBC Fisheries Center on cumulative impact mapping. Is that correct?
Yes.
Given our time allocations today, I regret I probably shouldn't take you to the whole article, but I'll take you to PDF page 8, which is page 883 of the actual article. And in it, the author states that in the absence of absolute field measurements, relative modeled measurements can still be used to direct future management and field research actions. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. I think the limitation of this paper really is that you have a whole lot of different cumulative impact scores for one point in time, and you don't have any data over time. So for the purpose of what we're trying to work at here, it's difficult, as it was also in the freshwater report, Technical Report 3, if you just have a snapshot, to be able to say, well, how has this changed over the last 20 years? And to what extent could that possibly explain the patterns that occur?
So more for the methodology than the conclusions, but rather what the authors are there is saying that that if we don't have absolute field measurements, relative modeled measures can still be used to direct future management.
Yeah, I think in general that's true. When I looked at this paper, I wasn't sure how you would use these maps to direct management. It wasn't clear to me.
So I'm going to take you to, maybe before I do that, may I have this marked as the next exhibit?
Exhibit 1911.
Let's go to our tab 6, which is exhibit 1345, which is the HIDA map that I'm not sure you had an opportunity to review.
This. It's a nice
but the commissioner has seen this map on a number of occasions, and maybe I'll just, if you keep going, sorry, go right to the map.
I think it's the last page, isn't it?
That's right, there it is. Now, what I'm going to suggest to you, and we're going to get to this more in your recommendations, but if you don't have all the particular causation, the data to prove causation in a scientific or legal perspective, but you have a map in which you have clearly set out areas of importance, areas of sensitive potential sensitivities, and the potential stressors, that might be a useful way of streamlining data and making management decisions in the absence of evidence.
Okay, so yes, so for example, for protecting critical areas, yeah, I think that's a reasonable approach. You look at what special areas need to be protected and what's the total cumulative stress on those areas. That's a logical thing to do.
And potentially quicker than long-term data and scientific analysis.
I think it depends on what question you're trying to address. If you're trying to address, say, a land use planning or a marine planning question as to where you should allow certain kinds of developments, just like as in the Fraser River Estuary Management Program, they have certain red areas that have zero development, no development. There's certain green areas which are already highly developed where they allow more development to occur. So you're trying to focus the development in that way. So I think from a land or marine use planning point of view, that's useful. As I said earlier, I think it's tough to use this kind of snapshot information for the kinds of questions that we were addressing retrospectively.
No, absolutely. What I'm looking for is helpful ways in which we could do adaptive management in the future, given all the unknowables. And so we can take step one and say, okay, we're just going to rely on the scientific method and we'll wait for 5 or 10 or 15 years when we have the confidence in the experiments and the confidence in the outcomes. Or we can, at the same time, be mapping sensitive areas so we're very clear where we shouldn't be taking risks.
Right, I would call that prudent management rather than adaptive management. Adaptive management sort of become a plastic word where it means almost anything these days, and so I think of adaptive management as being rigorous implementation of management using experimental principles, so you learn from them.
All
So
right,
that's
so
just a qualification there.
I'll be happy with prudent management in this
Okay.
case, that's for sure. All right, now before turning to the science management interplay, I want to pick up on an example of what so far I've identified as an uncertainty in your report, and I just want to see whether whether my read of this. Now, if you note that your figure 3.3-1, which is the figure that has all of the different interplays, and I note that pathogens and disease is a potential stressor in every life stage of the Fraser River sockeye salmon. You'll agree with me on that? One just before that.
I think I got a little too far.
Sorry, for some reason, right across that reference, I don't, Mr. Lemon. I apologize.
Find it in a second.
There, it's just right next to.
Not PDF.
Yeah, the document, page 18. That's
There
this
it
one,
is.
yeah.
Sorry, Mr. Munn. So I just note that pathogens and disease are identified as potential stressors for every single life cycle of this Fraser River sockeye. Is that correct?
Yes, potential stressors for which we have no exposure data.
It's clear that one form of the evidence that you relied upon in making your assessments of this information are the technical reports. And I want to go to technical report 12, which I believe is exhibit 735. Now, that's the technical report done by Dr. Johannes, is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And you would agree that he may have discounted various factors as stressors prematurely or without the appropriate amount of data?
I read some of that in the transcript. I think it's important to recognize that when we were looking at the freshwater habitat factors for this cumulative impact assessment, we relied mostly on technical report 3 because that was by Nellitz et al., because that covered all of the 36 conservation units and looked in detail at correlation evidence for, I think, the 18 or 19 stocks. So because we're looking at the whole Fraser as opposed to just the lower Fraser, we relied more on technical report 3 than we did on technical report 12
And
for our
so
conclusions.
is that because you weren't comfortable with relying on technical report?
No, it's just
12?
because of the spatial extent of the two studies. Basically, technical report 3 was looking at all the stocks over all of the Fraser River and looking at contrast. They also had a cumulative stress estimate. So, as I was asked about earlier, there was a greater breadth and depth of evidence in technical report 3 for the retrospective ecological risk assessment that we were doing.
Did you, when you were reviewing this report, also review the additional appendices provided by Dr. Rossino?
Oh, with the reviews?
The
That's
reviews,
one of the.
and he actually, in addition to his review, provided specific appendices. I can bring those forward to you.
No, I did not review those.
Okay, in the time remaining, I think I'll pick up on my questions on the recommendations. Before that, I just want to put before you RTAD 8. And I appreciate it's a basic, I might call it Science 101, and bear with us on that. But did you have any chance to look at this?
Oh, I've known this paper for a long time.
Oh, great. That's even better. Do you agree that it's a good summary of the interactions of risks and uncertainties with cumulative impacts?
Yes, I do.
Could I have that marked as the next exhibit?
1912.
Thank you very much. And I wanted to clear up something that I've heard a couple of times in your evidence, and I just want to make sure that I've heard this correctly, which is a number of times you've talked about how scientists can help the risk analysis. Would you agree that it's not just scientists that need to do the risk analysis? That though it's, I mean, you've quite quickly put trade-offs as policy decisions. But I want to suggest to you that how people measure risk and how comfortable they are with risks and the impacts of those risks can be quite different depending on the nature of the rights and interests that they're concerned with.
Oh, absolutely. That's part of the process of discussion.
And so the risk analysis that you're talking about is not just a scientific inquiry. It requires a broader breadth of perspectives involved.
That's right, and an understanding of the willingness to accept different levels of risk by different groups.
And so yesterday, when you were talking about your suggestions as it relates to page 104, which is the setting of the research agendas, and then the questions that you have specifically set out in page 107 of your report, those are both decision trees and analysis that require participation by First Nations in the context of their rights. Is that correct?
As well as other groups, yes.
But you'll agree that First Nations must be at the table, that this is not a scientific alone discussion.
Oh, I think the things that are listed at the bottom of page 107 require dialogue amongst all of the interested parties. And I guess what I would suggest is that, just as in, for example, the water use planning process, where there are a variety of stakeholder groups represented, as well as technical analyses that fed those discussions, that something roughly analogous would be helpful for doing this prioritization.
And then also because in cumulative impact assessments or multiple stressor situations like Fraser River sockeye salmon, the work of researchers needs to be very tightly interactive with the work of decision makers. Is that correct? And so you need an interplay between the science and the management that's quite consistent and iterative.
Yes, I agree with that.
Okay, in the time that I have, I'm going to start with my questions on the recommendations then. And if we can go to your table 5.2-1. I've just got to ask a couple of preliminary questions because I heard how you described it yesterday. Your charts include explanatory importance to, and as I understand it, to overall trends. And then you have a column called relevance to management actions. And it's going to be that one that I'm going to spend a little bit of time with you. But I just want to get, how did you come to your conclusions in that one? I mean, you're a group of scientists working on your own here, and given our dialogue just now, I'm a little curious on how you were able to manage to weigh relevance to management actions.
We were building on the Pacific Salmon Commission table 5-3, and you don't have to get it up right now, but essentially these column headings are similar to those. So it kind of, there's a bit of a ancestral aspect to where these things came from. And it says, if you go up to the caption here, if you could just go up, Mr. Munn, a bit. So it says relevance to management actions, i.e. the value that such knowledge has for informing potential management actions. So there we're talking about things that managers could potentially change in, let's say, harvest or habitat or hatcheries, hydro in the case that there are some, there aren't that many in the Fraser, as opposed to explanatory importance, which are things that help you to understand what's going on, why trends are happening, which is relevant to management as well, but is a bigger question.
And you'll agree with me, given the preliminary discussions we've had, that how people weight that might be quite different depending on their interests and concerns.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah, all right. So I think we don't have to then battle about which one's right, but I'll just try to get a sense of what your thinking was when you gave your thoughts on that. So let's start with parental spawning success and incubation. Now, it's likely unlikely to be the root of observed productivity declines. However, highly relevant to management, I would suggest, since spawning success and egg survival directly affect the development of spawning escapement goals and the conduct of fisheries. Would you agree with me on that?
Parental spawning success and incubation, I mean, what's usually done to try to establish escapement goals, as we talked about in quite a bit of detail earlier with Mr. Harvey, was using spawner recruit data to try to understand that. Now, there's also some of the detailed information on, for example, condition and numbers of fry that can help to inform discussions about density dependence and so on. If you go down a little bit in this table here, so we can just see that whole row, if we're going to talk about that row. So it says number one is better estimates of watershed conditions over time to better understand current status, causative mechanisms, and risk thresholds. So that's important.
Better understanding of the status of smaller conservation units consistent with the implementation of the wild salmon policy. Like, those are three very important components to management and to how we're moving forward.
Right.
And so just so that we can be clear, we had difficulty with your relevance to management actions being low. We actually think the relevance to management actions of those steps is quite high, and the choices that we have to make around that quite high. So I'm just wondering if you might give us your thoughts on that.
I can understand that interpretation. I guess the question is really the extent to which, the way we're thinking about this is, how can you, what management actions might need to change in order to improve the current situation so we get better productivity? So I'm sorry, so that was affecting us. And when I say us, I include the Pacific Salmon Commission Science Panel, who also gave this low. And basically what they're saying is, well, it didn't look like habitat was a likely explanation of the patterns. And so if you then, and you certainly want to maintain habitat as much as possible, we don't want to ratchet back protection of habitat, for example. But it's not as though if you suddenly had a lot more information about those early life history stages that you would then implement a bunch of actions which would recover those stocks. That's kind of why the implication was that it's not as though there are management actions you can do that are really going to turn that around.
So I guess that maybe we'll take that. I mean, I did go back to look at the PSC report on this, and they also gave parental spawning success and incubation low, but they didn't place into that comments and issues for recommended research all of the things that you have. I mean, they weren't placing the implementation of the wild salmon policy into that.
Right.
And so I think that's where the potential mix-up has happened, and I really want to clear this up.
No, I think that that's a good point in that we expanded the recommended research and monitoring activities based on all the technical reports. And so from the point of view of implementation of the wild salmon policy and understanding the status of those, I think it's fair to say that it would be appropriate to raise the relevance for that particular recommendation. And looking at this table now, it would probably be better to actually go through each of the recommendations and have an explanatory importance relevance to management actions, like within each row. In other words, you'd split this thing and have 3 sub-rows within it. We didn't have time for doing that. And I just want to say about these things is that, this is a long list. There's like 20-something, 23 things, right? And it would be a lot of money to do all these things.
Yes,
right?
we're going to get to that, actually.
And we don't think it's necessarily going to have that much money. We also didn't think it was our call to start narrowing down the list, funneling it down for the reasons you've just stated.
No, and I appreciate all that, and I appreciated you saying that that's for a broader group of people to do.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to be very careful, because this could influence that broader group, and it definitely could influence that commissioner. And so what I've heard you say is that having had this dialogue, you would change the relevance to management actions, given that you've put the wild salmon policy and the conservation units into this, and give it a higher score.
Right. I think for the implementation of the wild salmon policy, having a better understanding of the status of smaller conservation units has a high amount of relevance to implementing the wild salmon policy.
Given the time, Mr. Commissioner, thank you.
Thank you. Hearing is now adjourned until 2 p.m.